The Christmas season in the Philippines is unlike anything in the world. Filipinos usually start their preparations for the Christmas celebrations as early as September, with festive lights illuminating roads and houses even before Halloween. By December, thousands flock to terminals and ports, buying tickets for buses and ferries to their hometowns to spend the rest of their holidays. Traveling for Christmas is a long-held tradition that continues in the present day. And back in December of 1987, among those who would make this trip was a man named Salvador Baxol. Early in the morning on December 20th, 1987, in Tacloban City, Salvador and his daughter, Aludia, joined the queue for tickets to board the MV Doña Paz, a passenger ferry that would take them to the capital city of Manila. Given the peak travel season, the Baxols knew that their trip would be far from comfortable, and they were right. As they found their bed inside the ship, they were met with the sounds of babies crying and people putting down cardboard mats and blankets to sit on the floor. The Doña Paz could only transport up to 1,500 people, including its crew. But as young Aludia surveyed the ship before it departed, there was a lingering fear in her heart. Because by the time the Doña Paz sailed through the Tabla Strait, located approximately 300 kilometers south of Manila, it was obvious that the ship was severely overcrowded. Many of these travelers were chance passengers, people who were willing to sleep on the floor just to arrive home before Christmas to see their loved ones. But tragically, most of them would not make it. A few minutes before midnight, a loud explosion rocked the ferry. An oil tanker that was carrying over 8,000 barrels of flammable petroleum had struck the Doña Paz, igniting one of the world's deadliest maritime disasters of the 20th century. In just a couple of hours, over 4,300 passengers and crew perished, more than the number of lives lost on the Titanic. The Baxols were fortunate to have survived for now, but they faced an agonizing choice: to meet their end either by drowning or by burning alive.
On December 19, more than 1,500 people perished after a passenger ship, Doña Paz, packed with vacationists bound for Manila for holidays.
From One Up Media, this is Mass Murders. The Philippines has over 7,000 islands, and ferries like the MV Doña Paz are one of the most important modes of transportation for millions of Filipinos. Standing 3 stories high, the ship had undergone multiple renovations and rechristenings before it was known as the Doña Paz. Originally named the Himeyuru Maru in 1963, it had a maximum capacity of 608 passengers. But in 1975, this number had doubled. Sulpicio Lines, a Filipino shipping company, purchased the ship and transformed it into one of their flagship passenger ferries with the name MV Don Sulpicio. Renovations and reworks had increased the passenger capacity to 1,500 people, and it was now set to sail on the country's busiest shipping route, connecting the major cities of Manila and Cebu. However, the ship's operations were only short-lived after a fire in 1979 rendered it a total loss. Fortunately, all 1,164 souls on board were saved, and 2 years later, in 1981, the ship was salvaged and refurbished. The company had successfully managed to bring the ferry back to life and back to service, but this time with a new name, the Doña Paz. Recognizing the ship's potential, the company decided it would serve a secondary route for the shipping line, ferrying passengers between Manila and Tacloban twice a week, with stops in Catbalogan City on the neighboring island of Northern Samar. An 800-kilometer distance lay between the two cities of Tacloban and Manila, and like most Filipinos, the Baxols chose the convenient and more comfortable mode of transportation, the ferry, over the less appealing 20-hour trip by bus. The ship was scheduled to depart from Tacloban at 6:30 a.m. on December 20th and arrive in Manila around 4 a.m. the next day, December 21st. But as they made their way towards the passenger quarters, Aludia grew anxious upon discovering that despite having purchased 2 tickets, she and her father had to share a single cot. A few minutes after settling down, she prepared herself for what would be a restless overnight ferry ride to Manila. The ship was already filled to the brim, and yet Aludia saw more and more climb aboard. From the corner of her eye, a family with multiple children and loads of baggage caught her attention, and just like her, this family had to share a single bed. It was clear that the ship was already overcrowded, but many more passengers were still boarding, including at least 1,000 soldiers from the Philippine Constabulary. By the time the ship departed, it was filled beyond capacity, making Aludia feel like they were packed in like cockroaches and ants. The Doña Paz was only designed to carry a capacity of 1,500 passengers and crew, but due to the holiday season, many people did not hesitate to pay and board the overcrowded ship just to reunite with their loved ones in time for Christmas. As a result, there was hardly any space on board by the time it had departed. To make matters worse, before the ship would even set sail for Manila, it was headed to Catbalogan City, where it unloaded a few passengers and took on even more. Most of these new passengers opted to sleep on the roof deck, with nothing but thin blankets or cardboard boxes as their makeshift beds. To the passengers, many of whom knew the ship was already overloaded, the choice was clear: squeeze in or spend the most precious time of the year apart from their families. Hours after leaving Catbalogan City, the ship set its course for Manila. At this point, most of the passengers had already fallen asleep, as it was close to midnight when it made its way through the Tabla Strait. Only a few of them, like Luzgardo Nieto, a soldier from Luzon, stayed awake. Restless, he decided to wander around the ship when a fellow trooper called his attention, looking concerned. He told Luzgardo that he heard a party filled with loud noises and boisterous laughter coming from the bridge. Salvador Baxel was also awake at that time, and like the 2 soldiers, he too heard the commotion going on at the bridge of the ship as he made his way to the open deck. On that night, he was standing on the open deck to get some fresh air after feeling suffocated from hours inside the crowded quarters. As he enjoyed the ocean breeze, his thoughts started to drift, but he was quickly jolted back to attention when something caught his sight. He squinted his eyes to get a clearer view of the object, and to his surprise, it appeared to be a fishing boat. But it wasn't a fishing vessel, it was another ship, and it was hurtling in his direction at alarming speed. The approaching vessel was not actually a fishing boat, but an oil tanker named the MT Vector, and it was carrying thousands of barrels filled with gasoline, kerosene, and diesel. Within minutes, the lights from the tanker loomed closer, and a loud, thunderous sound shook the entire vessel, waking everyone inside, including Aludia. Darkness had engulfed the Doña Paz. The electricity had been cut out, and panic began to spread inside the ship. Within seconds, passengers on the deck witnessed massive flames erupting at the stern, followed by a deafening blast. Very quickly, the flames started to spread, seeping inside the ship and reaching every corner. Passengers, gripped with fear, desperately searched for an escape, only to find themselves surrounded by flames burning at thousands of degrees. From her cot, Aludia saw the flames in the water as she frantically searched the ship for her father. Other passengers rushed to the sides of the vessel to see what was happening, only to discover that the entire ship and even the seas were already ablaze. The Doña Paz and the MT Vector had collided, with the tanker's bow crashing into the port side of the passenger ship. striking parts of the engine room and cutting off power and lights. Worse still, the collision sent several barrels of oil into the passenger ship and into the waters below, forming a massive fireball that engulfed both vessels. Just hours ago, the Tabla Strait was calm, but now it had literally become hell at sea. In the ensuing panic, thousands of passengers inside the passenger ferry were like mice caught inside a flaming cage, running around aimlessly just to escape the fire, the smoke, and the toxic fumes. In a frantic attempt to escape, passengers running on the deck caused a stampede, crushing those who had fallen, while others remained trapped inside their cabins due to the fire. Some tried to flee to the lower decks, mistakenly believing that the fire hadn't reached there. But as they descended further, they were met with a horrifying reality. They were trapped, surrounded by flames and smoke. In emergencies like this, the crew is supposed to stay calm and hand out life jackets to everyone. But on the Doña Paz, they got caught up in the panic and forgot all about the necessary life-saving protocols. However, that didn't matter anymore, because according to the records, the life jackets had been stored in the lower decks, which by this time was already ablaze and filled with thick, black smoke. Tragically, not a single crew member survived the disaster, and the passengers were left to fend for themselves. For many passengers, seeing the chaos that was unfolding inside the ship compelled them to jump overboard and into the sea. While it wasn't easy diving into oil-slicked waters that had fire on the surface, their decision to take the plunge saved them. Aludia clung to her father Salvador as the two jumped off the ship. They dived into the sea in the hopes that the water would spare them from the flames. But even in the ocean itself, hell raged on. Seconds later, another explosion erupted, this time from the MT Vector. The force of the blast sent metal barrels filled with fuel shooting into the sky like deadly missiles. As these barrels descended back into the sea, they ignited flames on the water's surface, turning it into a fiery inferno. Dozens of passengers, who had previously jumped overboard in a desperate attempt to escape the burning ship, now found themselves once again surrounded by flames. For Aludia and Salvador, escaping the fire on the ship was only the beginning of their ordeal. As they swam away from the blazing sea, they clung to any large object they could find to stay afloat. The water around them began to fill with charred corpses, some of which were those of young children. One of the survivors, Morris Apura, vividly recalls a wave of sadness hitting him as he swam away from the ship and bumped into the lifeless body of a child that looked to be about 3 years old. The child's body was badly burnt, and his eyes, while they were still open, no longer moved or blinked. Overwhelmed by grief and sorrow, Morris gently closed the little boy's eyes before he carried on swimming. Meanwhile, Salvador and his daughter Aludia navigated their way in the waters amid the flames, debris, and floating corpses. Earlier, when she jumped into the sea, the flames had burned several parts of her body and face, and the salty seawater only aggravated her wounds. She swam closer to her father, and the two clung to each other as they waited to be rescued. But it would take 6 more hours before the father and the daughter would be saved, and another 8 more for the others, including Luzgardo and 2 additional crew members of the Vector oil tanker. Out of the 4,300 passengers and crew, both from the Doña Paz and the Vector, only a total of 26 would survive. The fate of the others, however, would only be revealed the next morning. Miles away from the incident is a small island called Masbate, the largest of 3 major islands in the Masbate province of the Philippines. Majority of the residents here rely on the seas for their livelihoods, and on December 21st, they went about their day as usual, selling their fresh catch and swimming at the beaches, until something strange washed ashore. It was a large black lump that didn't look like a rock or a marine creature's carcass, but rather a human body. Upon closer inspection, local fishermen were shocked to discover that it was a dead body, burnt and covered in oil. This, however, was only the beginning, because throughout the next few hours, more and more bodies would wash ashore. When the Doña Paz collided with the Vector minutes before midnight on December 20th, 1987, an inter-island passenger ferry, the MS Don Claudio, witnessed the tragedy from afar. For a distance, crew members aboard the Don Claudio saw the unmistakable bright orange glow of fire illuminating the night sky. An hour later, they arrived at the scene of the disaster, but both ships had already begun to sink. The crew of the Don Claudio began casting huge nets and life rings on all sides of the ship as they plucked survivors from the sea, many of whom struggled with painful burn wounds all over their bodies. But for Eludia and her father Salvador Baxol, it would be at least 6 hours before someone would spot them. As the father and daughter desperately held onto a large object to keep them afloat, Salvador heard someone yelling, and he tried to get up. The yelling had come from crew members on the Don Claudio, and as they carefully approached the Baxols, they threw life buoys at the father and the daughter. Soon they started reeling the two onto the ship and helped them aboard, where they received first aid assistance. The Baxols were severely dehydrated, as were the other 24 survivors, including trooper Luzgardo Nieto. Nieto would eventually be the only soldier to survive out of the 1,000 who boarded the doomed ship. While already safe from harm, none of them had any idea about what had happened. But as the Don Claudio made its way to Manila, the true extent of the tragedy was about to unravel. A day after the collision, in the nearby islands of Mindoro and Masbate, dozens of bloated corpses began to wash up on its beaches. And even local fishermen, who were out at sea, started to find several dead bodies tangled in their nets. While they initially mistook them as dead sea creatures, they eventually made the grim discovery that these were human corpses. Most had been burnt beyond recognition and covered in black oil. The gruesome sight prompted residents to take action as well as find answers, so they decided to call the attention of the Philippine Coast Guard, which by this time had already started piecing together the puzzle behind the tragedy. The Philippine Coast Guard swiftly launched an investigation to uncover the cause of the collision, as pressure from the grieving families began to mount every second. Their initial findings pointed a damning finger at the MT Vector. It was revealed that the vessel was not only unseaworthy, but also on board were a crew of unqualified personnel, including 2 unlicensed engineers. The tanker had set sail to Masbate on that tragic night without being deemed seaworthy by the Philippine Coast Guard, a crucial document proving a ship's capability to perform at sea. As the investigation progressed, authorities uncovered more disturbing details about the Vector, including accounts from 2 crew members who survived the catastrophe. They admitted to having fallen asleep when the collision occurred, leading investigators to believe that no personnel were on lookout duty to prevent the crash. Furthermore, the MT Vector had a troubled history. Records indicate that the vessel had been operating without the necessary safety certifications and was poorly maintained. On the night of the collision, the ship was short-staffed and its crew lacked proper training and licenses. Additionally, a former captain of the Vector revealed that its steering rudder had been defective, but the ship's owners had chosen to ignore this issue. In summary, the negligence and lack of oversight that allowed the Vector to operate under such conditions were key factors behind the tragedy, and authorities were determined to hold the tanker accountable. But not many found the outcome of the investigation satisfactory, particularly the relatives of the victims who continue to demand the government, as well as the shipping company, for more. Sulpicio Lines, the owner of the Doña Paz, first reported that over 1,500 passengers had perished in the tragedy. However, just as the Philippine Coast Guard and the Board of Marine Inquiry were prepared to place the blame squarely on the vector, a deeper concern started to emerge. Investigators began to suspect that the death toll might be far higher than initially reported, and this suspicion grew stronger as anxious relatives gathered in the cities of Manila and Tacloban, their numbers swelling with each passing day. At the headquarters of Sulpicio Lines in Manila, a crowd of distraught people had gathered. They were growing increasingly desperate for information about the whereabouts of their missing loved ones. As hours turned into days with no concrete answers, the crowd's anxiety escalated into anger and frustration. The number of individuals storming the company's office swelled as hours became days and days turned into weeks, each person claiming to know someone who had boarded the ship for Manila. Staff and executives, armed with megaphones, repeatedly announced to the crowd that they would only accommodate relatives of the passengers who were listed on the ship's manifest. But the crowd in front of the shipping line's building was relentless, and they refused to give up. While the owners of the Doña Paz asserted that the ship had stayed within its passenger limits and only ferried around 1,500 people, authorities at the National Bureau of Investigations observed something unusual. Since the news of the tragedy first broke out, the number of missing persons reports in relation to the ill-fated ferry continued to pile up, eventually reaching at least 3,000. These figures were more than double of what Sulpicio claimed. Then they started to raise questions. Was it possible that the ship carried more passengers than it was permitted to? Or was this an attempt by Sulpicio to downplay its responsibility? Before the incident, we already knew that the number of people on the ship was far beyond its maximum capacity. But at that time, the public had no clue about this information. At the time, the maritime laws of the Philippines were lenient and ineffective when it came to passenger overloading. However, shipping companies like Sulpicio were still careful to avoid suspicion of overloading, as it could lead to the discovery of more rules being broken, resulting in immense losses. If the public found out that the Doña Paz was severely overcrowded, not only would the authorities dig deeper and find more disturbing details about the ship, but also its owners were to be blamed for the tragedy. In Tacloban City, private investigators and non-profit groups started to compile the names of the missing passengers who reportedly bought tickets and boarded the Doña Paz. And similar to reports from the National Bureau of Investigation, their findings revealed that the toll of the tragedy was higher than what was initially reported. It was clear then that Sulpicio Lines was doing everything it could to evade responsibility. But with so many lives lost, the public were determined to hold them accountable. Investigations into the Doña Paz tragedy dragged on for weeks, with the ship's owners consistently denying allegations of overloading. Sulpicio's lawyers even began questioning the credibility of the interviewed survivors. They pointed out that the survivors had no expertise and skills to make an accurate head count, despite their accounts of seeing passengers sleeping on the floor, on the roof deck, and multiple travelers sharing a single cot. But hardly anyone believed Sulpicio's explanations, especially after an unnamed official provided crucial information that would finally lead the shipping company to give up in its efforts to dismiss reports of overcrowding. The anonymous official from Sulpicio confirmed to an international news agency that the Doña Paz was indeed seriously overloaded, contrary to the claims made by his employers. Since it was the Christmas season, tickets were being sold like pancakes, and to address the demand of travelers eager to return to their hometowns, they started selling them illegally, including duplicating those that had already been purchased. This was not an isolated case for the Doña Paz. In fact, overbooking is a rampant and common practice among many shipping lines and transportation companies in the Philippines, particularly during the peak travel season. However, since passenger overloading is a violation, shipping companies had to make sure that they wouldn't leave any traces that could lead to its discovery. Consequently, they chose not to include the names of passengers who bought tickets illegally on the ship's official manifest. Soon, news of the overloaded ship spread like wildfire, and despite Sulpicio's attempts to suppress it, public attention quickly shifted to the conditions of the ill-fated ferry. But one critical question remained unanswered. Authorities had already established that the unseaworthiness of the vector and overloading on the Doña Paz had contributed to the tragedy. However, they still could not explain how the collision happened, and more importantly, why it happened. In the moments leading up to the incident, the crew should have seen it coming and could have prevented it. But they didn't. Were they distracted, negligent, or simply overwhelmed by the chaos on board? What were they doing during those crucial minutes? When the two ships were sailing through the Tabla Strait on December 20th, the waters were relatively calm, the night was clear, and contrary to earlier reports, both vessels were moving slowly. When Salvador first saw the vector heading toward the Doña Paz that night, the tanker was only cruising at 8 kilometers per hour, a relatively slow speed at sea. So why did it still collide with the passenger ship? The answer lay in the vector's defective rudder, which made the ship essentially unable to change course. It required at least 2 people to move the steering wheel, causing the vector to zigzag left and right, giving the illusion of a boat speeding ahead. Furthermore, the tanker was reported to have no personnel on the lookout during the incident. If the steering rudder had been functional and a qualified lookout had been on duty, they could have alerted the Doña Paz in time. As for the Doña Paz, investigators could only question its survivors, as all of its crew had perished with the ship, leading officials to a dead end. That was until Luzgardo Nieto, the soldier from the Philippine Constabulary, revealed a shocking piece of information. Just minutes before the Doña Paz collided with the vector, Nieto recalled a fellow trooper mentioning a party on the bridge, filled with loud music and boisterous laughter from the officers. Salvador Baxel later corroborated this statement, adding that he heard the same when he ascended to the roof deck. As the investigation unfolded, it was revealed that many of the crew members aboard the Doña Paz had been indulging in beer, glued to the television, or partying on the bridge minutes before the incident. Even the captain himself was reportedly watching a movie in his cabin. Nearly all of the senior crew members were distracted and neglected their duty to ensure the safety of their passengers. Authorities also discovered that only an inexperienced ship apprentice was left on lookout duty that night. But by the time he saw the vector looming ahead, it was already too late. Disaster was inevitable. The investigations and litigations surrounding the Doña Paz tragedy took years to conclude. But finally, a decade later, in 1999, a presidential task force released their findings, confirming that a series of systemic failures and poor safety regulations in the maritime industry had caused the two ships to collide. With over 4,300 killed, the impact and the aftermath of the Doña Paz tragedy was so massive and far-reaching that it caught the attention of the entire world. Time magazine declared it as the deadliest maritime disaster in peacetime. National Geographic named the catastrophe as Asia's Titanic. International figures such as Pope John Paul II and Queen Elizabeth II also offered their condolences to the Philippines, and in particular, to the families who continue to fight for justice for their loved ones. Sulpicio Lines announced that the Doña Paz was insured for 25 million Philippine pesos, or approximately $752,000 when adjusted to today's rates. However, the company only offered a settlement of just around 20,000 Philippine pesos, or $646 for each victim. But there's a catch. If the victims had agreed to the settlement, the survivors would not file any lawsuits or hold Sulpicio criminally liable. This sparked outrage among the victims' families, who staged a mass rally demanding fair compensation and accountability for all victims, including those not listed on the passenger manifest. But despite the public outcry, the Board of Marine Inquiry eventually cleared Sulpicio lines of fault and shifted the blame to the Vector instead. In 1999, the Supreme Court of the Philippines ruled that the owners of the Vector would be the only ones responsible for the tragedy. Nearly 4 decades have passed since the tragic sinking of the Doña Paz. In 2019, during an underwater expedition, a team of explorers had finally located the wrecks of the 2 ill-fated ships. This discovery not only allowed young Filipinos to learn about this grim chapter in their country's history, but also highlighted the importance of maritime safety. It also brought some form of closure to the families of the victims and served as a stark reminder of the lives lost. The name Sulpicio Lines has since been retired, but the family who owns it continued to do business in the maritime industry. However, the haunting shadow of the Doña Paz tragedy lingers, casting a long, dark shadow over the company and the nation of the Philippines. In 2009, after a series of financial losses, Sulpicio Lines made the difficult decision to abandon its passenger fleet and concentrate solely on cargo operations. This decision came in the wake of another devastating incident in 2008, when their largest vessel, the MV Princess of the Stars, sank near the island of Romblon, killing over 800 passengers and crew members. These tragedies starkly remind us of the ongoing struggle to ensure safety at sea, a struggle that, if neglected, results in nothing short of mass murder. Mass Murders is a One-Up Media original. A quick word on our reenactments and dramatizations. While we can't know exactly what they say, think or feel at the moment, it is all based on research. Mass Murders is produced by Ethan Sam. Our executive producer is Guang Jin. Story writing and research by M. Audio engineering by Vung An and Ethan Sam. Narrated by Jason. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.